Dear students, viewers, and the subscribers, welcome to the IAS Mentor. This would be lecture number 65 in the series Indian Polity. We are almost coming to the close of the topic Union Executive. We have seen about the President, we have seen about the Vice President. Now we are going to see about the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers in this particular lecture. We are trying to understand the position of the Council of Ministers under the Constitution, and we'll also try to understand the constitutional position of the Council of Ministers vis-a-vis the President under the Constitution, and of course what are their powers, functions, and how they are to be appointed. What is the view that has been taken by the courts with regard to the advice that is given by the Council of Ministers upon the President. So these are all the things that we are going to understand. And of course, we will also try to understand the classification of the Council of Ministers. Although such a classification is not given in the Constitution, but for practical reasons, there are some classifications that exist among the Council of Ministers. So we'll try to understand all these things in the present lecture. We will take it one by one as we'll proceed. As I already said many times, this series is going to be extremely useful to the students preparing for UPSC IAS examination, but not only for UPSC IAS examination, it will also be useful for the students preparing for other competitive examination as well. So before I get into today's lecture, the first thing that you have to understand is the Council of Ministers or the real executives in a parliamentary democracy. Although the President is there, who is the head of the Union Executive, the President is not the real executive. The President is only a nominal executive. And that's because the Constituent Assembly has chosen for what is called as a parliamentary democracy. So the first thing that you have to understand is, what do you understand by a parliamentary democracy, or what is a parliamentary system? So what is a parliamentary system? A parliamentary system or a parliamentary democracy is a kind of political system wherein the government is formed from the legislature. So from where does the government is formed? The government is formed from the parliament. To be very specific, in our country, the government is formed from the Lok Sabha. At the union level, I am discussing about the union government. So you see the union government, the elections will be over. After the elections are over to the Lok Sabha, say for example, recently we have got the 18th Lok Sabha elections. After the 18th Lok Sabha elections are declared, the members of the Lok Sabha, whoever is declared as the winner by the Election Commission of India, they will choose a leader. So the leader of the largest party in the Lok Sabha or the largest coalition in the Lok Sabha is usually appointed as the Prime Minister. So usually the leader of the largest party or the largest coalition, they stake claim, they go to the President to appoint them as the Prime Minister. So the President appoints the leader as the Prime Minister. And once a Prime Minister is appointed, then subsequently the Prime Minister will suggest the names of the other ministers to the President, and then the President will accordingly appoint the Council of Ministers. So this is how the government is formed. So from where the government is formed is usually from what is called as the Parliament. And once the government is formed, so one thing that you have to remember, so the ministers are not necessarily restricted only to the Lok Sabha, they can be from the Rajya Sabha also. But where is the system of parliamentary democracy? The government is formed only from the Parliament. And most importantly, in a parliamentary system, even after the government is formed, that is the Council of Ministers, even after they are appointed, they should always have a majority in the legislature. To be very specific, they should always have a majority in the Lok Sabha. At any point of time during the term of the government, if they lose a majority, then that government becomes an illegitimate government. That government will be dismissed by the President. The Council of Ministers shall be dismissed. So that is why we call that in India we have got what is called as a parliamentary democracy or a parliamentary system, wherein the government is formed from the Parliament and they are always accountable to the Parliament, to be very specific to the Lok Sabha, because they always need to have a majority in the Lok Sabha. So this is the crux of parliamentary system. To put it in one single line, in a parliamentary system, the legitimacy of the government comes with its ability to maintain the majority in the Lok Sabha. So in India, so that is the case of parliamentary system. So in a parliamentary system, the position of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers becomes very, very important, because they constitute what is called as the real executive. So now the question is, who appoints a Prime Minister? So as I already discussed, it is a President who appoints a Prime Minister. Usually the conventional practice is that anyone who is the leader of the largest party after election or the leader of the largest coalition is appointed as the Prime Minister. So is that only the leader of the largest party will be appointed as a Prime Minister? Yes, that's a conventional practice we have been following. But however, when there is a hung parliament, so this is what is very important. However, when there is a hung parliament, so what does it mean by a hung parliament? Hung parliament is a situation when there is no obvious party which is having the majority. The election is over, not even a single party is having the majority, or there is no coalition which is having a clear majority. In that particular case, the president can exercise what is called a situational discretion. So this is one instance where the president can appoint anyone as the Prime Minister, although the party may not have the majority. So this is something that is allowed as per our conventional practice. So this is one instance, or there's another situation. Let us assume the Prime Minister is there, the Prime Minister suddenly dies. And if the Prime Minister suddenly dies and there is no obvious successor to the Prime Minister in the party, then also the President can appoint anyone as a Prime Minister. So we do have examples for that. Say for example, in 1984, President Gianni Sale Singh appointed Mr. Rajiv Gandhi as a Prime Minister after the death of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. At that point of time, Mr. Rajiv Gandhi was not even a minister. Mr. Rajiv Gandhi was not even part of the cabinet. But still, the president has exercised his discretion in appointing him as the Prime Minister because there was no obvious successor at that point of time. And similarly, another example is in 1989, President R. Venkatraman has appointed Mr. V.P. Singh as the Prime Minister. After the 1989 Lok Sabha elections, no party had a clear majority. And then the president has exercised his discretion in appointing Mr. V.P. Singh as the Prime Minister. But however, remember, in all these cases, although they can be appointed as the Prime Minister, they need to prove the majority in the legislature. They need to prove the majority in the Lok Sabha in a specified period of time. It can be 1 week, it can be 10 days, it can be 15 days, it can be 1 month. So whatever is the time that the president gives, the government has to prove the majority. And if they don't prove the majority, then they cannot continue to be the Prime Minister. So this is how the Prime Minister is appointed. So the Prime Minister is appointed by the President. Normally the conventional practice is who is appointed as a Prime Minister is someone who is the leader of the largest party or the leader of the largest coalition. But when there is a hung parliament and when there is no party which is having an obvious majority, then the President can exercise his discretion. In fact, the Delhi High Court has made it very clear. It is not necessary for someone to prove the majority before being appointed as the Prime Minister. Only after appointed as a Prime Minister, then they have to prove the majority. And the Supreme Court has also made it very clear that someone who is appointed as a Prime Minister need not necessarily only from the Lok Sabha. That means they can be a member of Lok Sabha or a member of Rajya Sabha also. In fact, someone who is not a member of Parliament can also be appointed as a Prime Minister as per the Constitution. The only thing is, if somebody who is not a member of Parliament is appointed as a Prime Minister, then they have to become the member of Parliament within a period of 6 months. So then only they can continue to be the Prime Minister. Otherwise, they cannot continue to be the Prime Minister. So these are all some of the important constitutional provisions that probably you will have to keep it in your mind when you talk of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers. What are the other constitutional dimensions with regard to the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers under the Constitution? One thing that you have to remember is, before someone assumes the office as the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister should be administered an oath by the President of India. So who administers the oath to the Prime Minister? It is the President who administers the oath. It is not only that the Prime Minister is appointed by the President, the other Council of Ministers, the other ministers are also appointed by the President. So this is very, very important. UPSC has asked this question number of times. It is usually said that the Prime Minister is appointed by the President and the other ministers are appointed by the Prime Minister. No, that is wrong. The Prime Minister is appointed by the President and the other ministers are also appointed by the President, but on the recommendation of the Prime Minister. So in every case, whenever a minister is appointed, who appoints a minister at the union level? It is the President. Not only the Prime Minister, even for the other ministers, the President has to administer the oath. Only after administering the oath, they can assume the office, be it the Prime Minister or the other ministers in the Council of Ministers. And it is also very important under the Constitution, you should remember that both the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, they hold office during the pleasure of the President. So understanding the expression pleasure of the president becomes very, very important. So what does it mean by the pleasure of the president? Does it mean when we say that the president and the council of ministers hold office during the pleasure of the president, does it mean that the president can remove the prime minister and the council of ministers at his whims and fancies? Can the president remove the prime minister and the council of ministers at his will? Pleasure of the president means any time as it is wished by the concerned person, is what does it mean by pleasure of the president. So can the president remove the prime minister and the council of ministers at his will at any time he desires? No, that is not the correct understanding. Although in the examination, if it is asked that the prime minister and the council of ministers hold office during the pleasure of the president, if this statement is given, this statement is absolutely right. You cannot call this statement to be wrong. But as a student studying the polity, we should understand as to what is the meaning in which it has been given in the constitution. While the literature of the constitution is, it says that the prime minister and the council of ministers hold office during the pleasure of the president, but what is the real meaning behind that? The meaning behind that is, as long as the prime minister and the council of ministers, as long as they have the majority in the house, they cannot be removed by the president. So the pleasure of the president can be exercised only when the prime minister and the council of ministers lose their majority in the parliament. To be very specific, lose their majority in the Lok Sabha. But as long as they have the majority in the Lok Sabha, they cannot be removed. So this is the basic understanding you should have. So when this pleasure can be exercised? This pleasure can be exercised only when they lose the majority, not otherwise. So this is the basic understanding you need to have. So with that understanding, we'll move forward and let us try to understand as to what is the functions of the prime minister. First, let us try to understand the functions of the prime minister. Once we understand the functions of the prime minister, then I'll go into the other constitutional dimensions with regard to the council of ministers as well. And then subsequently, we'll try to understand some of the case studies as well with relation to the prime minister and the other council of ministers. Now, if you see that the prime minister is the real executive, the prime minister is the de facto head in our country. He is the real executive in a parliamentary system. So therefore, in our country also, who is the real executive? It is the prime minister. Therefore, the prime minister has certain important functions to perform under our constitutional system, and we can club that into major heads. One is the prime minister has important functions in relation to the council of ministers, because who is the chief of all the council of ministers? It is the prime minister at the union level. The prime minister function in relation to the president. In fact, the prime minister acts in close relation with the president. The prime minister has important functions in relation to the parliament, and of course, the prime minister has got other miscellaneous functions as well. So the first and foremost is what is the function of the president in relation to what is called as a council of ministers. So in fact, you understand the entire council of ministers are appointed by whom? By the president, but however, they are appointed on the recommendation of what is called as the prime minister. So without the recommendation of the prime minister, the council of ministers cannot be appointed. So that's a basic thing that you'll have to keep it in your mind. And that is not the only thing. So the appointment of the council of ministers itself happens with the recommendation of the prime minister. And apart from that, among the council of ministers, if there is any differences of opinion, who is going to take care of all these differences of opinion? Who is going to coordinate between various ministries? Who is the one who will allocate the portfolios to various ministers? Who will determine who will take care of the home portfolio? Who will determine who will take care of the defense portfolio? Who will determine who will take care of the finance ministry or the portfolio? Everything will be decided by the prime minister. It is the prime minister who had to decide all those things. And according to that, the president appoints the minister. And if there is any differences of opinion between the ministers, that is also coordinated by the prime minister. In fact, it is the prime minister who will get all the cabinet committees of the ministers. So these are all the functions of the prime minister in relation to what is called as the council of ministers. And what is the function of the prime minister in relation to the president? One important article that you'll have to remember in this particular regard is Article 78 of the Constitution. If you look into Article 78 of the Constitution, Article 78 of the Constitution makes it very, very clear that the president need to apprise, the prime minister need to apprise of the president with regard to the various affairs that has been carried out in relation to the administration. So it is the responsibility of the Prime Minister to keep updating the President as to what the government has decided with regard to administration of our country. And if this is not updated by the Prime Minister, sometimes the President can also call upon the President to do so. In fact, it is a Prime Minister who acts as the bridge between the Council of Ministers and the President. So whatever they want to communicate to the President, it goes through the Prime Minister. It is the Prime Minister who will advise or who will suggest or who will recommend the names of the ministers, and according to which the President will make the appointment. So these are all the functions that the Prime Minister does in relation to the President. And it is also an important function of the Prime Minister in relation to what is called as Parliament. In fact, the leader of the government in the Parliament is nothing but the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister, whatever he makes, becomes the authoritative statement of the government in the Parliament. It is the Prime Minister who lay down the major policies of the government. It is a Prime Minister who get to decide the budget of the government. In fact, though the budget is presented by the Finance Minister, as per the Constitution, it is supposed to be laid down by the President, but on behalf of the President, any of his subordinates can do that. So normally the portfolio of budget is with the Finance Ministry or the Finance Minister, but even before the budget is presented, the Finance Ministry will take the approval of the Prime Minister in that. So the Prime Minister get to decide finally as to what kind of budget is presented in the Parliament. Alright, so these are all some of the important functions that the Prime Minister does in relation to the Parliament. In fact, it is a Prime Minister who will set the agenda of the government in the Parliament. It is a Prime Minister who will recommend to the President as to when the sessions are to be summoned in the Parliament and when the sessions are to be prorogued. So everything is suggested by the Prime Minister. Therefore, the Prime Minister plays an important role in relation to what is called as the Parliament. And then apart from that, the Prime Minister also plays a lot of miscellaneous functions. In fact, the Prime Minister is a chairperson of a number of commissions in our country. The Prime Minister is a chairperson of the Interstate Council. The Prime Minister also heads the Niti Aayog. So in this way, a lot of other miscellaneous function is also performed by the Prime Minister. There's a long list of it, but again, not very important for the examination. Try to have a very basic understanding. So now you will understand, based on the powers that you have discussed in case of the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister plays a very key pivotal position in our administrative system, and that is why he considered to be what is called as, among the real executive, he is the prime of all the ministers. So therefore, he is considered to be what is called as the Prime Minister. And then other constitutional dimensions with regard to the Union Council of Ministers. So the Constitution also gives certain other constitutional dimensions for the Union Council of Ministers. So let us get to understand that as well very quickly. So before we understand that, we'll have to understand two important articles in the Constitution. So what are the important articles? Now, what is the primary function of the Council of Ministers? The primary function of the Council of Ministers is to aid and advise the President. And therefore, the President has to act in accordance with the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So, Article 74 makes it very clear. Though the President is the head of the Union Executive, who shall advise the President in discharging various duties and responsibilities? It is the Council of Ministers, which they are supposed to do under Article 74, and such an advice is also binding. So, this Article 74 is very, very important. And apart from that, apart from Article 74, if you look into Article 75 of the Constitution, that also brings certain important dimensions. Article 75 of the Constitution makes it very clear that who shall appoint the Prime Minister and the other Council of Ministers? It is the President who shall appoint the Prime Minister and the other Council of Ministers. Nobody else can appoint the President, appoint the Prime Minister and the other Council of Ministers. So who gets to appoint the Prime Minister? The President and also the other Council of Ministers. And then apart from that, you should also keep it in your mind that there is a cap that is mentioned in the Constitution as to what shall be the size of the Council of Ministers. So what shall be the size of Council of Ministers under the Constitution? The exact number is not given, but a maximum range is given in the Constitution when it comes to the Council of Ministers. What would be the maximum range of Council of Ministers? The maximum range of Council of Ministers that you'll have to keep in your mind shall not be more than 15% of the strength of the Lok Sabha. So whatever is the strength of the Lok Sabha, of that 15% can be the maximum number of ministers. It can be less than that, no issue. but it cannot be more than that. So that is what the understanding you should have. That is the cap that is given. And as you already discussed, both the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers hold office during the pleasure of the President. So pleasure of the President means what is understanding you should have? That the pleasure comes into existence only when the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers loses the majority in the House. As long as they have the majority, that is not an issue. So once these basic understanding is there, let us also try to understand other constitutional dimensions and the functions of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers in our country. So first and foremost thing is that we should understand couple of cases before we understand the other dimensions of the Council of Ministers, including the Prime Minister. One such important case in the history of India is what is called as the UNR Rao case in 1971. What is the relevance of this UNR Rao case, where the Supreme Court has made it very clear that even if the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, or in other words, even if the Lok Sabha is dissolved, after the Lok Sabha is dissolved, is it possible for the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers to continue in office? Now we already seen that whenever the majority is lost, then the government becomes an illegitimate government, or the government has to resign. So the question is, whenever the Lok Sabha is dissolved before the elections, or because the no confidence motion is passed against the government, whatever may be the reason, if the Lok Sabha is dissolved, then what will happen to the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers? Will they have to resign? Will they have to resign, or will they continue in office? So this was a question that was answered by the Supreme Court in the UNR Rao case. In the UNR Rao case, please listen to me very carefully. In the UNR Rao case, the Supreme Court made it very clear that even after the dissolution of Lok Sabha, the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers continue to exist. What will happen to the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers even after the dissolution of Lok Sabha? They would continue to exist in the office. They continue to exist because under the Constitution, there shall always be a Council of Ministers to aid and advise the President. So the Supreme Court said, as per our constitutional system, the President cannot act in isolation. The President always need a Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers to advise him. So therefore, the UNR Rao case made it very clear, even if the Lok Sabha is dissolved, the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers will continue to hold the office. So therefore, they can aid and advise the President, and the President cannot act on his own. So does it mean that even after the dissolution of Lok Sabha, the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers continue to hold the office and they'll give any kind of advice to the President? The Supreme Court clarified this also. The moment the Lok Sabha is dissolved, while the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers would continue to exist in their office, but they are merely what is called as a caretaker government. So this word is very, very important. They become what is called as a caretaker government. So what does it mean by caretaker government? A caretaker government is not a full-fledged government. A caretaker government has very limited powers. So what are the limited powers of a caretaker government? So this caretaker government can only give advice to the President on day-to-day administration. They cannot give any advice with regard to the new policies that may be carried forward. So with regard to day-to-day administration, they can give the advice, and they will continue to give the recommendations or the advice related to the day-to-day administration till the new government is elected. So therefore, the UNR Rao case made it very clear that there will be a Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers even if the Lok Sabha is dissolved, but that government would be a caretaker government which will advise the President on what is called as day-to-day administration. So this means students who are studying the subject should be very, very clear that whenever the Lok Sabha is dissolved, it is not that there will not be any Prime Minister and then Council of Ministers. They would continue to exist till the new Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers are appointed. But till that point of time, after the Lok Sabha is dissolved, the government would become a caretaker government which would only advise the President on day-to-day administration. If any advice is given related to new policies, then the President is not bound to listen to such an advice. The President is bound to listen only to the day-to-day existing policies, nothing more than that. So this is the understanding you should have. And apart from that, there is also one more interesting case that you will have to keep in your mind is the Shamsher Singh case. This was a case that is brought in front of the Supreme Court majorly to address the issue as to what is the relation between the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers. Sorry, what is the relation between the Council of Ministers and the President? Not between the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, but between the Council of Ministers and the President. Or in other words, this case majorly dealt with the question whether the aid and advice given by the Council of Ministers is it binding upon the President. If you look into the original constitution, there was nothing in the original constitution to say that the aid and advice which is given by the Council of Ministers is binding upon the President. So therefore, there were some presidents in our country who did not act in accordance with the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. Therefore, this question was brought in front of the judiciary to see whether the aid and advice which is given by the Council of Ministers is binding upon the President. The Supreme Court made it very clear that the aid and advice given by the Council of Ministers is binding upon the President, and so the aid and advice which is given by the Council of Ministers in the state is binding upon the governor, except in those areas where they can act in their discretion. Because the Supreme Court in this particular case categorically said the kind of government in our country is modeled on the lines of parliamentary system in United Kingdom. So in United Kingdom, the advice which is given by the Council of Ministers is binding upon the head of the state, who is the British monarch, who is the king or the queen there. So instead of that, India is a republic. We have an elected president, but the positions are almost similar. There the king or the queen is a nominal executive. Here the president is a nominal executive. So therefore, they are bound to act in accordance with what is called as the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. This is what was held by the Supreme Court in the Shamsher Singh case. Therefore, the Shamsher Singh case brought in a clarity that the President is bound to act in accordance with what is called as the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. Now, what was held by the Shamsher Singh was brought into the Constitution by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976. For the first time, Article 74 was amended, and it was made very clear that the President shall act in accordance with the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. By inserting this provision, the Indira Gandhi government in 1976 wanted to make it very clear that the aid and advice which is given by the Council of Ministers is binding upon the President, and the President is to act in accordance with that. So what was interpreted by the Supreme Court was brought explicitly into the Constitution. So henceforth, after 1976 and Shamsher Singh case, there was no doubt in this regard that the President has to act in accordance with the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So this was the constitutional position in 1976. But subsequent to that, in 1978, by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act, which was carried out by the Janata government, after the emergency was over in 1978, Janata Party came to power. So they amended Article 74 again, and they said that while the President is bound to act in accordance with the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, or the President shall act in accordance with the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers, but if the President is not happy with any of the advice, he can send such an advice once for reconsideration. So the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act gave power to the President to send the advice once for reconsideration. How many times it can be sent for reconsideration? Only once the advice can be sent for reconsideration. So once the President can send it for reconsideration, but despite such reconsideration, if the Council of Ministers again send back the advice, then it is binding upon the President. So therefore, one privilege has been given to the President, or it is giving the power, the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act, to send the advice once for reconsideration to the Council of Ministers. But as I already said, if it is sent back again, then the President is bound by such advice. So this is basically some of the important constitutional dimensions and the interpretations of the court. You will have to keep it in your mind. And apart from that, the Constitution makes it very clear that the oath of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers will be administered by the President, and the salary of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers shall be determined by the Parliament. So these are all the important constitutional dimensions you will have to keep in your mind. Apart from that, the Council of Ministers are collectively responsible to the Lok Sabha. When I say collectively responsible to the Lok Sabha, the entire Council of Ministers are collectively accountable to the Lok Sabha, and whenever something goes wrong with the government, and if there is a no confidence motion that is passed against the government, the entire government has to resign. So that is the basic understanding you should have. And the entire government has to resign and therefore there is a collective accountability or a collective responsibility. Apart from that, there is also a concept of what is called as individual responsibility. So what is this individual responsibility? Individual responsibility means that if any particular minister has done something wrong, if there is any act of corruption in a particular department, or if there is inefficiency or maladministration in a particular ministry or a department, then the minister is individually accountable for that, and therefore he may resign for that particular purpose. That is basically individual responsibility. And apart from that, if you look into the composition of Council of Ministers, the Constitution does not provide any composition of Council of Ministers. As in other words, the Constitution uses only one thing, that there shall be Council of Ministers to aid and advise the President. And further, the maximum size of the Council of Ministers is restricted at what is called as 15% of the size of the Lok Sabha. But however, there is no classification as to different grades of Council of Ministers in the Constitution, but for the administrative convenience, as per the transaction of business rules, there are different grades of Council of Ministers. At the highest level, you have what is called as the Cabinet Minister. So this is how it is classified. At the highest level, you have Cabinet Ministers, or let me just make a little bit easier for you to understand. So let us assume that this is the entire Council of Ministers. Let me put it this way. So let us assume this is the entire Council of Ministers. In the entire Council of Ministers, so the inner group is what is called as the Cabinet Ministers. They are the highest ranking ministers. And then you have what is called as MOS, Minister of State. And then you have what is called as Deputy Minister. So all the three categories of ministers would be combinedly called what is called as Council of Ministers. So what is the difference between Cabinet Minister or the Minister of State or the Deputy Minister? Well, the Cabinet Ministers are the senior most members in the party, and the Cabinet Ministers are the most important ministers who will definitely have an independent portfolio or an independent charge. And what is a Minister of State? Minister of State, they are all not given the cabinet rank, but they are given independent portfolio. So for example, when you take off cabinet ministers, say for example, today in the present union government, Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman, Mr. Amit Shah, Mr. Nitin Gadkari, so and so forth. There are a lot of ministers who are having the cabinet rank. But however, if you see Mrs. Nirmala Sitharaman, when she was initially become the finance minister, at that point of time, she was given only the Minister of State. But she was given the portfolio with independent charge. But later, she was elevated to what is called as a cabinet minister. So that means cabinet ministers will definitely have an independent portfolio. Minister of State, they will have an independent portfolio, but they are not given the cabinet rank. And then the third thing is what is called as deputy ministers. So who are the deputy ministers? The deputy ministers are those people who are not given charge of any ministry or department. They only assist the Minister of State or the cabinet ministers in discharging their duties and responsibilities. However, try to understand that this distinction is not given in the Constitution. It is only for the administrative convenience. This is there in the transaction of business rules. Okay, so this is what you will have to understand. Further, let us also try to understand the concept of what is called as kitchen cabinet or the inner cabinet. So normally there can be 20 to 25 cabinet ministers. So it is a roughly that I am giving. This is not the exact figure. So normally today the system that is followed in our country is all major decisions of the government is not decided by an individual minister or not only individually by the prime minister. Say for example, there is a defense minister, there is a home minister, there is a prime minister. Suppose if any major decision is to be taken by in the defense ministry, it will not be decided only by the defense minister. It will be decided by a group of cabinet ministers. So the prime minister will call upon the group of cabinet ministers, the relevant cabinet ministers. So he may call upon 10 to 15 cabinet ministers, and they collectively decide on this. So that is the reason why there is what is called as collective responsibility. So for that particular reason, if you see in our country, there are various cabinet committees for the ministers. There is a cabinet committee on political affairs, there is a cabinet committee on economic affairs, there is a cabinet committee on parliamentary affairs, there is a cabinet committee on defense. So in this way, there are a lot of cabinet committees in our country. So the relevant ministers will be called upon, collectively decisions will be taken by the government. But however, apart from the cabinet system, There is also something which is called as kitchen cabinet or inner cabinet. So kitchen cabinet or inner cabinet means that is a cabinet within cabinet. That is basically what is called as kitchen cabinet. So for example, the kitchen cabinet would mean only the close aides of the prime minister are called upon in deciding the things. That is basically what is called a system of kitchen cabinet or inner cabinet. Say for example, it is said that for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, although he may have 20 to 25 cabinet ministers, his kitchen cabinet is very much restricted. His kitchen cabinet or the inner cabinet is very much restricted only to few people. It includes, as per the sources, it includes, as per the internet sources, it includes Mr. Amit Shah, it includes the Principal Secretary to Prime Minister, Mr. P.K. Mishra. It includes a National Security Advisor. It includes the External Affairs Minister. So these are the people who are part of his kitchen cabinet. Now try to understand what is this concept of kitchen cabinet. The kitchen cabinet is not only restricted to the cabinet ministers, few cabinet ministers, it may also extend to some trusted bureaucrats and certain other advisors also. So based on which where the decision is taken is basically what is called as a concept of kitchen cabinet. So normally the decision is taken by the larger cabinet, but depending upon the prime minister, it may be taken by the kitchen cabinet also. In fact, every prime minister, right from Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi to Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, every prime minister to Mr. Manmohan Singh to Mr. Modi, every prime minister in our country had their own cabinet. That is, had their own kitchen cabinet. In fact, a smaller group of members who advised them in making various decisions. So this is basically what is called as the concept of kitchen cabinet. So if you see the entire lecture, we have tried to understand some of the constitutional dimensions related to Prime Minister, Council of Ministers, the interpretation that is given by the courts. All these things are going to be extremely useful for your preparation. Now with that, we are almost coming to the end of the lecture. So let us try to solve this question before we end the lecture. So looking into this particular question, consider the following statement as per the Constitution of India. Statement 1. The President appoints a Prime Minister. Is it true? Statement 2. The Council of Ministers apart from the Prime Minister is appointed by the Prime Minister. Which of the following statements given above are incorrect? So if you know the answer, please put it in the comment box. And I am sure that most of the students can easily answer this particular question. With that, I am coming to the end of this particular lecture. From the next lecture, I will start up what is called as the state executives. So where we will start with the topic of what is called as the governor. And the governor also plays a very, very important role. Once you are done with the governor, and then we'll go to chief minister and the council of ministers. And then finally, I'll take up the topic of what is called as the attorney general and the advocate general. So with the attorney general and the advocate general, our topic of the executives will be covered. Now, once I'm done with the executives, then I'll go on to what is called as legislature. So in this way, we'll proceed further, and in another 40 to 50 lectures, the series will be done. So probably by end of April, maybe the 3rd or 4th week of April, the series of Indian polity will be done. And after the Indian polity series is done, we will start certain other series. So in this way, we are trying to provide quality content for most of the subjects in the civil service examination, which will be useful for thousands and thousands of students who will be preparing in the future. So alright, so with that, I am coming to the end of this particular lecture. So if you want to reach out to me related to the examination or related to any queries in this lecture or the subject, you can reach out to me through my Instagram account or through my Telegram account. Thank you for watching this particular lecture. If you like this lecture, please like it and share it with your friends and family members who may be preparing for the examination. And I'm quite sure it is going to be extremely useful to the students preparing for the IAS examination and other competitive examination. Thank you very much. All the best.